What's good, everybody? It's obviously been a hot minute since I hopped on the mic, but we are back, and well, I'm not going to bore you with the pleasantries too much. I've had the research behind this particular video shelved for a really long time, really ever since Borna Choric won Cincinnati. It's been a continuation of over the last 2 years, revealing a trend of the waning dominance in Masters among the Big Four. I am one of those people that long remembers the time where the Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, Murray stranglehold on the Masters titles was about as strong as it was in the majors. We find ourselves in a time now where their primes are all long gone at this point, relatively speaking. Little by little through the back end of the 2010s, we saw that grip loosening, and now over the last 2 years, we are seeing that go one step even further, where the Big Four presence in the winner's circle among the next highest tier of titles down from the Slam in the Masters 1000s, their presence is almost non-existent in the winner's circle at this point, and more we are seeing first-time Masters winners. Those titles have really seemed up for grabs, like a lot of us that have been watching tennis over the last 2 decades really have not been used to, and I decided in this video I was going to delve into that more, take a look at the archives to really see how much this trend has bore itself out, as well as indirectly taking a look at just how ridiculous the domination of these 4 guys was at one time. So without further ado, looking into the Masters winners progression throughout the Big Four era, I framed this starting in 2005 just because with Rafa's emergence that year and breakthrough, that was the first year at which point we had at least multiple Big Four members playing at an elite level at the same time. Obviously, Roger had already started getting on a roll by the end of 03 and into 04. But really, once we had multiple Big Four members at an elite level, you can extend this span out of the peak Big Four pretty much all the way through 2016. During that span, there was at least 2 of them, if not 3 or 4 of them at certain points at an elite level at the same time, and the numbers really are staggering. Mind you, this is a sample size of 12 years, that is, with 9 Masters a year, 108 total Masters events played, and over the course of those 12 years and 108 events, you have 15 occasions during which the Big Four were kind enough to offer up any semblance of a big title. And so basically, during that span over 12 years, on average, about once a year, out of 9 tries where all the best players in the world, at least for the most part, were competing, in best of 3 where there is less leeway to survive those off days, anybody else would get a chance to raise that trophy up 1 out of 9 times. You had just 10 first-time Masters winners in that span as well, and 11 different men in total that raised Masters trophies outside of the Big Four in this span. Interestingly enough, people that had won Masters prior to this slam were just about shut out. Andy Roddick at Miami in 2010 was the only exception to this. Otherwise, everybody that won Masters was winning them for the first time, and oftentimes that was their only one. The gatekeeping by the Big Four during this time really doesn't seem real, and as a result, it really did marginalize a lot of guys that had excellent careers. And if you were only looking at their resumes and titles won, and didn't really get to watch these guys, that wouldn't at all tell the full story of how amazing they were as players. But most of these guys just happened to have the misfortune of having their primes and peaks align with that of the Big Four. And that can be said about just about anybody on this list during this time frame. But anyways, onward we go. I drew the line at 2016 due to the fact that that year saw Djokovic and Murray both at the back end of their primes. After 2016, it would essentially become the post-prime Big Three era. Unfortunately for Andy Murray, after 2016, we all know that he really never was the same player on account of that debilitating hip injury. But nonetheless, 2017 through 2020 still saw spans during which you would have at least two of the Big Three at an elite level. Albeit at this point in their careers, none of them really were able to dial it in and week out the same way and get up for just about every Masters tournament like they once could. For Roger Federer, this had probably been the case since like 2012. During this span, that would become the case with Nadal and Djokovic as well. Still, with each of them being in an elite post-prime phase of their career during this frame, they still were able to win the majority of Masters events held during this span. Obviously, during this span, we became more familiarized with the next gen of Zverev, Tsitsipas, and Daniil Medvedev. Throughout this span, Dominic Thiem was enjoying his best years, at least to this point. And in addition, we saw some of the veterans from the prior era, such as Dimitrov, Del Potro, Isner, etc. Those guys went through the last great surge of their careers during this span, and for some of them, it resulted in a Masters title win. In retrospect, it was a really interesting mix, and it made for 8 first-time Masters winners, 9 different men winning Masters titles. The Big Three ultimately still reigning supreme in this tier of titles, but noticeably more openings for others to get a bite at the apple than was the case from 05 through 2016, and that bore itself out as we went from 15 non-Big Four winners in 108 Masters events held to 13 non-Big Four winners of 30 Masters held. Must be noted, of course, that the majority of Masters events in 2020 were not held, but for the most part, even in this span, it did still seem like it was either Big Three or the young guns for the most part. Which brings us to the last 2 years where the scene has changed yet again, where Roger Federer pretty much ever since 2020 really hasn't been all that much of a factor, and now we know is retired. So on the Big Four front, we say, and then there were two, and even with a Nadal and Djokovic still going strong, it's pretty clear that their priorities lie within the slams. Everything else in comparison is kind of dwarfed. Their aging bodies really haven't allowed them to play nearly as many of those events as they used to, not even close. Add on this year the events that Djokovic has been denied entry to, and both of them have missed more than half of the Masters held in the last 2 years. And more often than not, even when they have played in these Masters events, the intensity hasn't been turned up nearly as high as it would for a slam. And as a result, more than ever, the Masters field is wide open. Obviously, the next gen guys have continued to add to their tally in the Masters, but very clearly in these events, their consistency has paled in comparison to what it was from the former Big Four. And that's fine, obviously. That type of consistency is something that probably will never be replicated. But as a result, pretty much these events have become up for grabs. In comparison to both 05 through 16 as well as even 17 through 20, the last 2 years have nearly evened up with first-time winners with 7, as well as with the amount of men that have clinched Masters titles with 9. And of course, with only an elite Djokovic and Nadal remaining from the Big Four, and their presence being very limited on the Masters circuit at this point, we have seen 12 non-Big Four winners of the 15 Masters events that were held up through Cincinnati, with still Bercy left to be held this season, meaning you've got a staggering 80% of non-Big Four Masters winners over the last 2 years. nearly doubling up that percentage for even the prior span from 2017 through 2020. So with all of these numbers in front of us, what can we really conclude out of this? Well, my first takeaway out of seeing all these numbers in front of me was, the obvious, that nobody ate on the Prime Big Four's watch. I touched on it earlier a little bit, but look at the names that managed to win Masters titles or a Masters title from 05 to 2016. Just about all of those guys, you can say, in most other eras win a lot more. Most of those guys had sparkling careers whose resumes do not at all speak to how great a player they were. You look at all those names, and the biggest outlier is Robredo and Lubicic, who was past his prime in 2010. And still, even those quote-unquote outliers, Robredo and Lubicic were respectively a career-high 5 and 3 in the world at a certain point, and made quarters and semis of slams. Those are the ones that stand out as unusual or outliers in the span. Still great players. And also, you look down that list, and 8 out of 15 were won in Shanghai / Madrid or Paris. Big titles still, absolutely, but it is no secret that as the tennis calendar wanes, players have tended to wear down at the back end of the year, and even certain years the Big Four have not been immune to that. Obviously, this is not to discredit some of those runs. I'm pretty sure even there, about half of them were done defeating at least a Big Four member along the way. In fact, you have Nalbandian's Madrid 07 run where he beat all 3 of Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer. But still, I felt that was something interesting to pick up on. In addition to that, I also feel that this is another piece of evidence supporting the notion that it was indeed a Big Four all the way through Andy Murray's prime and his time as an elite top player prior to the hip injury. Obviously, Andy Murray's 14 Masters titles look dwarfed in comparison to the video game numbers of Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer. But we do have to keep in mind that Andy Murray ranks 5th all-time in Masters. He trails those 3 guys and Andre Agassi, the former record holder. And even though the tier of Masters was only created in, I believe, 1990, where we don't really have the data for their equivalences for guys in eras prior to the 90s, that's still a good amount of all-time great players that Andy Murray stands atop in this category. And nobody else during that prime Big Four era really even comes close. Next up is Davydenko at 3, and Stan Wawrinka often compared to Andy Murray because each of them have 3 majors. This is just another check in Murray's box and goes to show just how much more consistent he was than Stan, who only had the single Masters title in Monte Carlo in 2014. Add in how many times Murray put himself in position to face off against those 3 demigods during this span, his week in, week out consistency, racking up this many big titles at the time, as well as eventually becoming number 1 at the end of it. I think that a case for a Big Four during this time is pretty clear cut. And finally, I would say that laying all of this out would incline me to believe that we should expect more first-time Masters winners. Obviously, the pace of that has picked up over the last 2 years. It's been different to what we're used to, for sure. There are quite a few names that are sort of head-scratching that have won Masters, even going back 5-6 years. Guys that I'm frankly pretty confident wouldn't have won them in 05 through 16. But at this point, that is just the state of affairs with an aging Big Two remaining now. The Masters more than ever have become a land of opportunity, and the guys who win them still should get their due respect. I feel like most of the time the guys that have won them have been in pretty good form, put in good showings for themselves. You look at even the last 2 with Carreño Busta and Coric, who won Montreal and Cincinnati respectively, seemingly out of nowhere. But in both those cases, and many others like it, Those guys went on some crazy heaters during those tournaments and arguably played better than they ever have before or since. I know it's a far cry from what anybody that saw any portion from 2005 to 2016 were watching, but very clearly the old guard's barrier has fallen on the Masters. It only really remains with the slams. And with that being said, I would expect things to continue trending in this direction on the Masters field. But that's all I got for this video. Felt like this was a really fun and interesting deep dive to get into. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed. If so, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like on the video, help the video perform better in YouTube's algorithm, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Thank you again so much for watching, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.